Good afternoon, and welcome back to HealthLeaders The Winning Edge program, a weekly series of webinars touching on the topics and strategies that you need to know most. My name is Chris Cheney, and I am the CMO editor for HealthLeaders and will serve as your moderator for this session. Today's webinar is titled The Winning Edge for Promoting Physician Wellness, sponsored by AMA. Thank you to our sponsor and you and our audience for participating. Before we get started, for those of you participating in the live program, I have a few housekeeping details. Our program will be approximately 60 minutes in length. Note that an on-demand version of this program will be available on your YouTube channel on Friday and can be accessed through our website, healthleadersmedia.com. To ensure that you can see all the content for the event, please maximize your event window and be sure to adjust your computer volume settings and/or PC speakers for optimal sound quality. Next, you will find a resources list for today's webinar on the upper right of your screen. Here we have listed the webinar slide deck for you to download, along with supplemental resources. Additionally, you will find a registration link for future The Winning Edge events. At the bottom of your console are multiple widgets you can use. To submit a question, click on the Q&A widget. It may be open already and appear on the left side of your screen. You may submit questions at any time during the presentation. However, please note that it is likely that your questions will not be answered until the Q&A portion of the program. Finally, should you experience any technical difficulties during today's program and need assistance, please click on the Help widget, which has a question mark icon and covers common technical issues. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists. Thomas Campbell, Chief Wellness Officer, Allegheny Health Network. Jim Gilligan, Vice President, Health System and Group Partnerships, American Medical Association. Amy Jibilian, Chief Wellness Officer, Lehigh Valley Health Network. And Sean Jones, Medical Director of Provider Wellness at Baptist Health Medical Group. We're still trying to get Dr. Jones on the line, and he may join during the presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Let's get into our discussion after a brief introductory comment. Any discussion of physician wellness cannot ignore the plague of physician burnout, which is a tragic situation and has a significant impact on patient care. Society expects physicians to heal and comfort people when they are suffering, but about half of all doctors are themselves suffering from burnout, which includes emotional, mental, and moral injury. In research, physician burnout has been associated with compromised patient safety and care quality. Physician burnout spiked during the coronavirus pandemic. In a 2021 survey, 62.8% of physicians reported experiencing burnout symptoms. In 2023, 48.2% of doctors reported experiencing at least one symptom of burnout, according to AMA data. This is the first time the rate of physician burnout was below 50% since 2020. Now let's get into our discussion. First, please tell me a little bit about yourselves and your organizations. And Tom, why don't you start off?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm Tom Campbell at Allegheny Health Network in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My journey into well-being began approximately 7 years ago when we decided to begin a program, and I had the support from the system chief medical officer to provide a program. My background for 30 years prior to that was in emergency medicine, which is always at the top of that list as the highest level of burnout. And I always had this feeling that I needed to dig deeper into why that was, because I was enjoying my career, and it continues to be a long career as I still practice in the emergency department at least once a week. So with that in mind, we developed a program. I was given a title of Chief Wellness Officer, and part of my goal was to start to measure annually burnout, not just in physicians, but our nurses, our physicians, APPs, and residents as well. And so I've been following that route. The program has had some successes. We've had some things we've had to revamp and try again, but it's continued, and I'm enjoying it very, very much.
Amy, go next.
Thanks, Chris. So Amy Jibilian, and I am a general pediatrician by training. And like Tom, I was able to practice clinically for about 30 years. And I took a step down from my clinical practice in the middle of 2021 and was heading into pseudo-retirement. But the opportunity to serve as Chief Wellness Officer at Lehigh Valley Health Network was presented to me. And I took on the role, again, with Tom, as Tom was saying, just having walked in the shoes of clinicians and had started to experience the changes that we were facing in healthcare, and seeing my colleagues, nurses, myself, even struggle with some of these new forces that were affecting us. And so I thought it would be an amazing opportunity to step into the role and see what I could do to assist colleagues now in a different position. So I'm happy to be here.
Great. Jim, go next.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today. My name is Jim Gilligan. I am our vice president of all of our health system and group partnerships at the AMA, and so I get a chance to wear a few different hats. But our goal at the AMA, as many people know, is to be a powerful ally for all physicians in patient care. And when you look at some of the things that we spend a lot of our time and focus on, one of those is reducing burnout and improving the joy in practicing medicine for our physicians in the country. And the other hat I wear is I get a chance to run our AMA health system member program. And so a majority of the work we do in that space is working with leadership at our health system partners to make sure they have the resources in place to do exactly what I just mentioned, reduce burnout and improve the joy in practicing medicine. So excited to be here today and share some of the best practices that we've been able to see from our viewpoint.
Excellent. Let's get into our discussion topics. How can you reduce barriers that physicians experience when it comes to reaching out for help? And Tom, why don't you go first?
Sure. Chris, when I hear that question, one of the first things that comes to my mind are how do we reduce stigma so that physicians especially are more willing and able to reach out for help when they need it. And I think one of the things that I think is important is that we follow what the Lorna Breen Healthcare Foundation has started a big initiative with great success, and that's to rid of stigmatizing questions, not only on individual hospital applications, but on state licensure applications. And many studies have shown that part of the reason people don't reach out for help is they believe that it will hurt their ability and their career longevity, and even starts in early career in medical school for physicians. And so I think getting rid of those questions that really have shown to really not benefited anybody, and in fact probably did more harm than benefit, is a great project that many of us are involved in and have done within our own institutions, but also rallied around organizations to help get the state licensures removed. And again, probably all of us are advocates of the Lorna Breen Healthcare Foundation that was founded in the name of an emergency medicine physician who took her own life. And in her honor, the foundation was formed and has really had some great success. So that's the first thing I'd like to add without spending too much time.
You can expand if you'd like.
I'll pass it to my fellow participants.
Sure. Amy, why don't you go next?
Sure, thank you. So such an important question, and I agree with Tom wholeheartedly. I think the other, as we're talking about stigma, so there's we need to be investigating and changing these barriers, right? That stigma that's associated with a physician seeking help. So it comes to also, I think, the culture in that we work in. I think physicians, part of our temperament and part of our training for years, starting back in medical school, is that we are supposed to be strong, that we are supposed to be superhuman, that we should be able to handle anything that comes our way, and that if we start to recognize that we're struggling, this word of, oh, I'm a failure, this shouldn't be happening to me, starts to be our internal voice. And so I think to combat that internal voice, we need external voices that are coming alongside our clinicians and saying, it's okay to not be okay. It is okay to need help. And I think this should come ideally from the highest level of leadership, not just our behavioral health services, not just your chief wellness officer, but we as a whole institution and all healthcare organizations bring this out to light and say, this is something that we all struggle with at times, right? Burnout, exhaustion, anxiety, depression, and it's okay to feel those things and ask for help. I think that's a really important part of this piece. And I do think having leaders voice that, not just the smaller segments of our population who are caring for well-being. I think the other thing that is really big is this concern of confidentiality. So that if we are seeking help within our own healthcare system, so probably most healthcare organizations have EAP. Many have peer support groups. But physicians are really hesitant to seek help within their own networks, because even if they're told everything's confidential, they don't really believe it. So I think for healthcare systems to partner alongside external partners that could provide therapy in a confidential manner, 24/7 access is really critical. And we have embarked on that journey at LVHN, and we're starting to see people take advantage of this. And I think we're lowering some of that barrier now, and people are now being a little bit more willing to ask for help.
Great, Jim.
Yeah, Chris, I'll tell you, you're in really good hands with Tom and Amy here, because they absolutely hit on the important point, which is reducing the stigma and putting appropriate language on credentialing forms and creating a culture are two of the most effective ways to reducing that stigma. I'd go a little further and say you have to make sure that that's also supported by a really effective communication strategy with your providers. I've done a lot of work with Henry Ford, and I can tell you that they went through the hard work of putting the right language in the credentialing forms, but then they realized they need to go back and create a really effective strategy to make sure that providers knew about those changes. And we're aware of those changes. And I think Amy hit it right on the head when she mentioned it's okay to not be okay. Just making sure that you have a communication strategy that creates that cultural foundation. I think it's Sanford Health that actually has a working mantra that says exactly what Amy said. It's okay not to be okay. And so I think the more you put that in front of your providers and make them feel it and believe it, the strategies of putting the right language in, creating a culture are going to go a lot further.
Excellent.
Chris, it's Tom.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Tom.
Can I add one thing about the culture? I found that if you have some leaders, especially physician leaders, who can show their vulnerability, it creates a culture and allows people then to realize that it is okay to not be okay. And, there are some places out there that do it really well. One of the best internal examples I have is my DIO. When he welcomes new residents and fellows into the organization, he talks about his own challenges and his struggles with imposter syndrome when he was in training and had to even take a break. And his vulnerability in showing that really goes a long way. And he's very thoughtful in that he tells the story right with the introduction as they're coming into the organization, and the very next speaker is me, so that I get to tell them, here's all the resources that we have if you ever feel that way. after they heard from someone who has had his own struggles. So I think if you can do that, and whether it's with mental health, addiction, or other problems, I think if you have some leaders that can show their vulnerability, it helps create that culture, as Jim and Amy pointed out, that it's okay to reach out for help.
Thanks for adding that, Tom. So what are the primary measures that healthcare organizations can initiate to help physicians remain healthy? And Amy, why don't you start us off?
So actually, Tom and I talked a little bit about this together. And so one of the things as a primary measure is for healthcare organizations to actually develop a structure, a system within their organization to address physician well-being. So, and that is creating a group, so a wellness committee, a well-being council, with leadership involved. So creating a chief wellness officer or similar position in the organization. So I think just an organization saying this is very important and we're going to attend to this and we're going to start to put some time, energy, and money into this is a great first step. And with that, I think ideally an organization integrates that chief wellness officer or similar person into that highest levels of leadership so that that person can be carrying the banner that says, hey, we need a quadruple aim here. Tending to the well-being of your physicians and the entire health force here is super critical. And so that person can weigh in on conversations and remind everybody, or even just pose the question as people who are a lot smarter and wiser in running a healthcare organization, just have my little voice that says, so how will this impact on the well-being of your people? Just, so that little reminder. So I think, again, setting up a structure, having some leadership, having a voice to really emphasize and promote how important this is.
Tom, anything to add?
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Amy and I are part of a group. We're both in the same state, and there's a group of chief wellness officers from across the state that talk. And we talked about this. And I think in order to, the primary measures, as the question states, I think really are some of the things we've said. What can you do to create a culture of people caring for each other? That they're more comfortable, they get to know each other, and they care about each other, which was a little difficult during the times we did a lot of virtual care, virtual being, but now we're back to a lot more face-to-face after the pandemic. And I think we can focus on, again, how do we get people to know each other, care about each other, reach out for help and find. But in addition, as Amy pointed out, I think having a program with a structure is really important for most organizations, in that if I sort of follow, and a lot of us do, the Stanford model of well-being, which is around culture, which we've talked about, personal improvement, which is really different for each physician. Sometimes it's focusing on your mental health, your physical health, your relationships, the things outside of work. But then the third arm of that model is really focusing on efficiency of practice. And I think culture and efficiency of practice in that model, and from my experience, are the most important. If we can keep working on paying attention and focusing how many hours our physicians and APPs and residents are spending in the hospital and making their practice more efficient, I think we will go a long way in making them healthier, happier, and prolong their careers in medicine. And so in order to do that, you have to measure, and you have to definitely have some focus on those areas. And I think we're all seeing great leaps and bounds in the electronic health record with a lot of things that are happening now to make it more efficient, so that our clinicians can spend more time with patients, but also end their work in a normal time during the day, get out and enjoy the rest of their lives and all. So I think that's, if I had to focus on one thing, create, several things, it's really creating that culture of caring and getting to know each other, but also how do we make the practice more efficient? And in order to do that, we really have to keep an eye on the hours people are spending at work.
Yeah. And if I could piggyback onto that, Tom, absolutely. So how do we help promote physicians' health? I think it's helping physicians to prioritize their self-care, which it also comes out of that work. So we're not very good about caring for ourselves. We're very good about, expending ourselves at all costs to help our patients and our families and our friends, but we're always last. So can an organization start to help us prioritize? Absolutely. I think it can. And like that work outside of work, how can we start to reduce work outside of work? And the other big topic we've been talking about recently is how can we help ensure our physicians take PTO, right? So we know there's a direct link with people not taking enough time off and burnout. So assessing that, and how can an organization, the system, support physicians in that? So we know people need nutrition, they need sleep, they need time with their friends and family, they need to be able to invest in other things that give them meaning. So I think it's tough, but I think this is something we could do at the system level.
Jim?
Yeah, Chris, I echo both what Tom and Amy said. I think reducing the burden on physicians and their ability to treat their patients, actually give them more time to treat their patients is key. Well, what I would add on to that, I know Tom touched on measuring, is I'd say a primary measure is to make sure you're measuring as an organization. And when I say measuring, around burnout questions. I think everybody would agree a physician with less burnout is probably also a healthier physician. But I think it's important. There's a lot of groups that are measuring, but I think it's how you're measuring. I always recommend use a validated burnout assessment tool versus just an engagement survey. And I say that because we recommend that systems keep 5 metrics on their dashboard when they're looking at burnout. And that is sense of reported satisfaction, sense of reported stress, sense of reported burnout, sense of feeling valued by their organization, and last but definitely not least, intention to leave their organization within the next 2 years. And so I think it's important that systems ask questions and allow them to keep an eye on those key performance indicators. And at the same time, also be able to compare that to any kind of aggregated numbers or national benchmark numbers to see how their numbers are stacking up against some of their colleagues across the country.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. How can healthcare organizations show appreciation for physicians and promote agency in their work? And Jim, why don't you start us off?
Excellent. It's a great question. And I would say, going back to something I just mentioned from the recommendation for a dashboard metric, is that sense of feeling valued. It's, again, not going to be a surprise that physicians that have a higher sense of feeling valued by their organization also have much lower levels of burnout and stress in the research that we conduct. And so, but the problem is, just over 50% of physicians in the country feel valued. So we have some work to do in this space. And so, so what does it mean for a physician to feel valued by their organization? A lot of it comes back down to communication. They want to know that they're getting timely, relevant, and authentic communication from executive leadership. And a big part of that has to be recognizing physicians for their contributions to the system and to the medical group. And then beyond that, I think a lot of organizations focus on the executive leadership need for communication, but also those frontline leaders, whether it's a service line leader or a physician who's got influence over other physicians. Systems need to make sure that they're staying committed and dedicating training to those physicians in what I'll call well-being-based leadership competencies, soliciting feedback, removing barriers, giving genuine recognition, being able to have a conflict conversation with one of their colleagues. But I think that's an important area for groups to focus on. And then also just making sure that providers feel like they have a sense of physical and psychological safety in their workplace environment. While you do that through putting effective policies against workplace violence in place in your organization, or also having effective peer networks where they can really have that collegial networking to talk through some of the issues they may be facing.
Tom or Amy, you want to chime in?
Go ahead, Amy.
So a couple of thoughts, just riffing off of Jim there. I think many organizations will do some larger appreciation, like physician appreciation events, which I think are great. So we had like a physician appreciation awards dinner, which is terrific, right? And recognizing our fellow physicians for their accomplishments. This year, also, our medical group had a like an Oscars program. So they had people nominated for like best producer, best supporting actor or actress, and then they had nominations, and then this on-stage production, and people dressed up as MCs, and people got trophies. So a lot of fun. Again, award recognition, but I think I like what you're saying, Jim. It needs to go down to that sort of day-to-day personal interaction where like a team leader is just having like on their radar that opportunity to say thanks to one of their colleagues. Great job, great save. What a wonderful thing you did for that patient. So I think there's many unsung heroes. There are many unsung heroes. I think every day we all show up as, great physicians healing, but it's not recognized. So if there's a way that we can just start to promote that positive, attaboy, attagirl kind of conversation, that goes a long way. I know for myself, whenever I received an email from a leader that said, I heard what a great job you did with this patient, it boosted my spirits and my energy so much. Even though I might have had 10 bad things happen that day, at least that one thing really helped me. So I just think those small moments of communication are important.
Yeah, and I have to also add on to what Jim said, because I learned a lot from the AMA. And one of the programs that they have a roadmap or a playbook about listening sessions. And I think what I've found, at least in my organization, is that those areas and groups of physicians who believe that they're being heard, even if all of their ideas and suggestions aren't acted on, but when they feel they're being heard and they get some feedback about what they've said, it's really helped. I think the more than just engagement, it's really made them feel a part of the organization. And they, as you pointed out in the question, they feel like they have some agency in the path that they're going. And so many times now, I think our clinicians are now not independent practitioners. They're owned by other organizations, and they've lost a lot of autonomy. And any way we can get that back and get some of that back to our clinicians so that they feel like they're engaged in the direction of the organization, institution, is one thing I found really important. And the other thing I found that's important that I think we take for granted that clinicians see all the time, and that's gratitude from their patients. I think if we can keep finding ways, and I think this show an appreciation, we have to really keep figuring new ways to do it and alternate ways of doing it. But I think when you can highlight some great work that clinicians are doing, as well as highlight the appreciation that their patients have, and whether that's done through a media campaign, anything you have internal communications, I think it really lets the clinicians know that what they're really for is to care for patients and their patients are getting great care, and it's seen and appreciated by leadership within the organization. That's not to say the pizza parties and parties celebrating them are important. We want those as well, but I think the other things are critical also.
Excellent. Anything else before we move on? Next question. How are you handling resident well-being? What programs are you implementing to support residents to create organizational culture of well-being? And Jim, I know this was a topic that you wanted to dive into, so why don't you start out?
Yeah, I'll say I'm really glad that this is a question, because I would say this is something that's trending that I'm really excited about. I would say prior to the pandemic, part of my role at the AMA was working directly with residents as our director of resident engagement. And when you looked at the well-being of residents from the viewpoint of administrators or program directors, program coordinators, faculty, there wasn't a huge emphasis on it. And I think part of that was, hey, they're going to be here for 3 to 5 years, and then they're going to move on to another system. So are we going to invest that kind of time and support on their well-being? That shifted. The game is really changing. Now that we're in this era of workforce shortage, we're seeing a lot more of systems that are putting a bigger emphasis on recruiting and retaining their own residents to come work in their system once their training's done. And so we are seeing an uptake in some of these residency programs and residency institutions measuring the level of burnout with their learners, and then looking for opportunities to intervene on some of the things that are systemic drivers of the burnout. And what's really neat, though, is then involving the learners in that process. So showing them the results from the measurement, talking to them about the intervention, some of the best practices that can be utilized to reduce the strain on them as learners. And that's so important, because if they are successful in getting them to stay within the system once they're done with their training, now you have proactively built the next generation of physician leaders that can continue to help you build a stronger and more effective health system, because they're looking for ways to reduce some of the burdens on their peers and treating their patients. And so to me, it's a really exciting trend. I would just say, from a recommendation standpoint, if you're measuring the level of burnout, you want to make sure you're using a tool that asks different questions than the questions you're asking your practicing physicians, because it's a different world, and you're not going to get effective results asking the same questions you would ask your physicians or APPs.
All right, I got disconnected there for a second. Tom, you want to chime in?
Sure. I agree with Jim. I think it's critical for many reasons. Boy, we've got to start even in the medical school level to have our learners and students start to think about their own well-being and how, again, their longevity in medical career is going to be affected in what they can do to keep an eye on their well-being. So starting early is great. And but I also think that ACGME in their wisdom also had some emphasis on wellness. And so I think they got a little bit of a head start, at least with some tools to measure. But I also have found that by creating an additional survey beyond the ACGME annual survey that the residents do, with some validated questions, as Jim pointed out, and especially the questions, as he pointed out, is if you were offered a position, would you stay? And if not, why? I think if you start to measure and follow that, you're also going to see how successful you are, not just in your education, but in keeping people engaged and well, so that they do a good job and know that they're supported and would want to stay in their organization. So I think very much like their faculty, I think they also want to be heard. I think it's extremely important to have resident councils and ways for them to voice their concerns. And sometimes it's things that you don't think are important, like food services. For residents, I found to be extremely important because they spend so much time in the hospital. This is where most of their meals are taken. And if we don't pay attention to the good meals, they're cranky. and and they really won't have a good experience. And it can be as silly as food services that make a big difference. But in order to learn that, we had to have some counsels and ways for them to voice their concern and to look at. So I think very much like their faculty, it's important to give them a voice and some agency in their residencies and residency programs as well, so that they can feel like they're making a difference, and they can make a difference if they remain and get employed by their health system.
Amy?
I think that Jim and Tom, answered that pretty comprehensively. So I'll pass if that's okay, so we can move on.
And Chris,
That's
I'll
fine.
just make one more point, because Tom mentioned ACGME, and I couldn't agree more that ACGME putting a common program requirement in around wellness was really important to make sure this was a point of emphasis for learners. But you also have to be careful, make sure you take a balanced approach to addressing this with residents, because if you want to see the torches come out, go and suggest to residents that they need more education on improving their resiliency or reducing anxiety, because they know that burnout isn't starting within them, it's showing through them. But there's some things that their programs are doing that are driving that burnout. And so I think while it's important to make sure that those learners have access to resources so they can enhance their resiliency, you also have to make sure you're looking at the root causes of the problem and not just focusing on offering them yoga and healthy food trucks.
Excellent. Next question. How can healthcare organizations provide opportunities for physicians to provide feedback and voice their concerns in forums that offer psychological safety? And Tom, why don't you start us off?
Sure. As I mentioned, and Jim is probably the expert, I learned a lot from the AMA in their listening campaign about ways we can do that and have a formal program with some good intention for physicians to give their feedback. The second part of the question, I think, is a little more difficult, and how do you do it in a psychologically safe way? And I think that is part of leadership development and creating some education with our leaders about how they can create a psychologically safe environment for their frontline employees to give honest feedback that they feel a part of, and that in the long run that's not a simple thing to do, but it does take some time, commitment, and education, I think, for the leaders to create that environment. And I think it's something that has to be, again, intentional through the training and with leadership across any organization or hospital system to be able to do that. We can all have open forums, but if people are afraid to speak up, it's a challenge. So I think if you have leaders who can admit they've made errors, who can admit that they're fallible, and really give good feedback from becoming good listeners, I think is really critical in that arena, but not simple to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Amy?
Yeah, so we embarked on a listening campaign at our network, and we've done it through about 4 to 5 departments now, and it's very interesting how we can see the culture of each department impact on the efficacy of a learning campaign. So I think it's a great forum, and it really depends on, again, who's in that room with the group of people and the tenor that we set in terms of this is a safe space to provide feedback. The challenge is then taking that, to the senior and executive level leadership, having them hear what people have shared and then provide the response. And I think that this is just sort of a small picture of what's happening on the grand scale, in that what we've seen is this separation developing between leadership and frontline workers, right? So you've got these two camps of people. And I remember Liz Harvey talking about at Chief Wellness Officer training camp. I call it training camp, training course. We've got to eliminate the villains and the victims, right? So each side is calling each other villains or victims. And so there's no crucial conversations happening, right? So how do we break down those barriers, as you're saying, and create that psychological safety? Those are crucial conversations, right? And there's no villains and there are no victims. We're all in this together. But each side, I think there's a lot of polarization. So I think that's a huge thing to address, and create that safety for both leaders and frontline clinicians to be able to talk openly and freely. I think leadership development, there's another question I know about leaders, so I don't know if we talk about that now or.
You can talk about it now.
Yeah, so we're talking about that leadership development and the skills that leaders can develop and become more skilled at, in these, how do we have these safe conversations? How do we listen? I love the article that is produced by Tate Shanafeld and Christine Sinsky and Mickey Trockle about wellness-centered leadership, right? And their tenets about wellness-centered leadership, which are, if I may say, like care about people always. The foundation is we all need to be caring about one another always, cultivating individual and team level relationships and inspiring change. And that if we all, leaders, frontline workers, we all start to move into that arena and we open up these channels for communication, wow, I mean, things could blow up in a good way, in a good way. So I think education, there's a lot of room for us all to learn, all of us to learn how to communicate better.
Jim?
Yeah, I would say, from our viewpoint here at the AMA, we'd recommend that you have consistent and ongoing communication about your organization's intentional well-being strategy. And I think if you can continue to communicate and put an emphasis on that, you're going to have some leverage in gaining trust and really credibility from your physicians so that they'll take advantage of any forums you might create for them to provide feedback. Now, that responsibility really falls on the executive level leadership and the chief medical officers and service line leaders. But listen, that's a distracted audience of leaders. And so we think it's important that you have well-being leaders within your organization. So we recommend that you have at least a 0.5 FTE who can lead a well-being strategy at your organization. So you have that consistent opportunity. One of the groups I thought really went from 0 to 60 in improving provider satisfaction was Oxygen Health down in New Orleans. They put Dr. Nigel Gurgra as their chief well-being officer and gave him a well-being office to support his work. And they really have made significant strides. In fact, they've been recognized at the gold level of the AMA Joy in Medicine Health System Recognition Program 3 times now, which is a really hefty accomplishment. And talking about Nigel, by the way, I want to go back to something Tom said earlier. When he opened that well-being office, one of the first things he did was pen a letter to all of the providers, sharing a very personal mental health experience of his own to really build that trust and credibility to get folks to share the stories. And then to build off something Amy said too, I think it's important that executive leaders are trained in how to do effective rounding with their frontline providers. But I think it's important that you follow up on that in an effective way. And so, be able to aggregate the feedback so that you can put together a really prioritized strategy in the right places, but then share those findings. So where are you prioritizing? What helped you make that decision? Share that findings with your providers so they can see you listen. And then certainly involve them in the progress you're making towards improving those issues.
And just one follow-up question on psychological safety. What can senior leadership do to promote it? I mean, I think we touched on this a little bit, but I'm just wondering what senior leadership can do to promote that environment of psychological safety. And Tom, why don't you start off on that?
I think my first thoughts when you asked that, Chris, is really to show their own scalability, and that they are open to listen. And so very much like I mentioned vulnerability before, I think if a leader shows they are not almighty, that they've made errors and they're willing to be flexible, it takes some time and effort to get there with when you have large groups especially, but I think it's critical to show that you are open to ideas and willing to listen, and you've made errors yourself, that you're willing to go back and regroup and make other considerations.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? Senior leadership promoting psychological safety? We can move on. Probably one more question before we get into the Q&A. How can healthcare organizations address workplace violence? And Amy, why don't you start us off?
Wow, so we know this is a huge issue now affecting healthcare organizations across the country, and we're talking about psychological safety, right? So it's, tantamount that all our healthcare workers feel safe at work. They need to have physical safety and psychological safety. So I think one, just acknowledging that this is really important, and that violence is never okay, whether it's verbal, physical, suggestive violence. So I think the one thing is just to acknowledge that violence is never okay. And if you've attended, or I've been able to attend, like an event, a Sentinel event, when somebody's hurt, and we start to hear the conversation, many nurses and physicians will say, it's just part of the job, right? We just expect it. So I think that's the first part in just saying, no, it's not okay. The American Hospital Association recently had a great webinar that I attended within the last month, and they gave some great steps for healthcare organizations. I just have a couple of them here. One is the education that, and again, leadership needs to be taking this message and promoting that through the whole system. Developing a team, right? So developing a workplace violence prevention team at your healthcare institution is critical. And having members of that team be from both the clinical setting as well as your safety and security, and that they need to be working in tandem to address this issue, and to be showing up in the areas where violence is occurring. Tom, the ED, trauma units, behavioral health units. The other is teaching our staff how to screen for somebody that might develop, or things might progress into a unsafe situation. Putting red flags into charts. So again, to just say, wow, somebody here has become violent in the past, flagging, having a plan of care, educating everybody on how to de-escalate, integrating your alarm system. So alarms, body cams, all those things. So I think the key, it's a lot of points, but is to have a dedicated team that has operations, clinical people, safety people working together to come up with solutions. And again, as we have said through this whole thing, communicating this with our physicians and our nurses and our whole healthcare team, that this is being addressed.
Tom?
Yeah, I agree with everything Amy said. I think it's important to have an oversight committee with senior leadership involved, and how critical it is. And just like the other things, you have to measure it. And it's really difficult to measure. As Amy pointed out, a lot of people think it's part of my job. I'm at risk if I'm working in healthcare to get hit and bit and spit on. And the measurement, at least in my own healthcare facility, it's difficult to get that measurement. because it's not simple for people to report those things and to get to employee health and do our annual wellness survey. We asked that question, how often does it happen? And that raised everyone's eyebrows, because that reporting that was simple with our survey showed how often it happened with our nurses and our physicians. And we know that people not feeling safe at work also is related to burnout directly. So I think having a group with all the resources, or as many as they can get, is really important. And it's not just about education. So certainly we want de-escalation training to be everywhere, but we also need additional engineering controls, whether that's screening with wands, police who actually have the ability to arrest folks, and even within the electronic health record, let's use the technology we have so that we can report this person has been violent before, and we know it, and we'll know it even before it goes to outpatient offices. And then I think you put that all, we even have new policies written when we realized how often our office staffs were being threatened through the electronic health record, and that, we are able to have someone not be able to send messages in the electronic health record once they've been given a warning if they're abusive to the staff. So I think you have to come at this from all different areas. And I'm glad it's gotten the recognition that it has lately, because we need to get at this in all different ways with policy making, education, technology, education, and engineering devices, and even lighting. Things as simple as great lighting can really help deter some activity that's harming our staff.
Mm.
And Jim?
I mean, those are great answers. And for anybody who goes back and watches a recording of this, they should fast forward to this segment, because I think you just got some great best practices from both Amy and Tom. Being from the AMA, I think it would be a little strange if I didn't bring up advocacy at some point. And so I would recommend that make sure your government relations teams are working with your state legislators to make sure that there's policies in place to protect your physicians. I think it's Louisiana, where they now view violence in the workplace as a felony. That's a pretty strong deterrent. If you know there's going to be punishment for your behavior in that to that degree, that's helpful. Make sure you have organizational policies together. And then, Amy touched on quite a bit about making sure the clinical staff's involved in the strategy. I had an opportunity to listen to some best practices from Geisinger Health in Pennsylvania recently. They did something really neat and innovative there. They actually are taking nurses and making them FTEs in the security office to really have that consistent integration of clinical experience with the team that's putting together the security strategy. And what they've said is the leader of their security team said, we're now involved in conversations we would never have ever been a part of before without having them as our liaison in our office. And so they've been able to make some really innovative improvements by making that move. So I thought that was a really neat best practice to share.
Very cool.
Thank you. Thank you all for an excellent discussion. This now brings us to the Q&A portion of the program. So we would now like to invite you in the audience to ask live questions of our panelists. As a reminder, if you are participating in the live program, to submit a question, click on the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen. It may be open already and appear on the left side of your screen. Please note that your questions will remain anonymous and will not be viewed by other audience members. Let's see what we got here. It's good to have a process for doctors to express burnout, but what are some of the causes? Things like loneliness and dealing with issues, administrative burden, internal and external factors. Get into some of the causes of burnout. And Tom, why don't you start us off?
Sure. I first thing I think that comes to my mind is efficiency of practice, the number of hours that clinicians have to put in. So I think one of the measures that are critical to follow is hours of work for clinicians, because if we don't have efficient practice, or we're having people work way beyond what we know is sort of the cutoff on hours to work, where you start to really fry, then to me, that's one of the most important things for physicians and nurses, is really look at the hours worked as one aspect. I'll let my partners talk about the other important drivers of burnout.
Amy?
Yes. So we know that, again, that work cognitive load, right? So we're now pushing people beyond cognitive load. And so that's work overload, whether it's cognitively or just the physical hours. It's a major driver. The other thing, when people are surveyed, is this loss of autonomy and control is a major contributor to burnout for physicians. And so looking for ways that that healthcare organizations can restore some of that to their clinicians is really important as well. The value that Jim talked about, if we look again at like what triggers burnout. So, loss of reward and recognition is really important. So if we become, I think what's really driving for many physicians is this loss of this ability to show up with all our strengths, what we're trained to do, which is to be there alongside of our patients, spend time to provide high quality and safe care. And when that's getting eroded by the pressures of time, particularly productivity, we lose our essential sense of meaning and purpose, why we went into medicine. So it's just really critical for us to restore those in ways that we can to promote that professional fulfillment.
And Jim?
A little bit, but.
Yeah, I would just say, Chris, folks should stay grounded to that. Burnout doesn't start in physicians; it just shows through physicians. And so, think about it. Why did most physicians get into this this profession? To take care of patients, take care of people. And if you're putting burdens in their way, that makes it so they're doing that less than half of the time with their daily work, then they're going to be burned out. And so I think that's the things people need to stay glued to, is how do we take those administrative burdens off of physicians? Because at the end of the day, that's what the root cause of burnout is.
That's all the time we have for questions today. In closing, please note that next week's program will cover the winning edge for recruiting the best nurses. A live clickable link will appear at the close of this program, taking you to our registration page for the event. Remember to follow along all week as we cover the topic of promoting physician wellness on our website, healthleadersmedia.com. I want to thank our panelists once again for an excellent discussion, and our sponsor, AMA. Finally, thank you to you and our audience for participating. We hope that you enjoyed today's program and look forward to seeing you during next week's program on recruiting the best nurses.